Welcome back to the channel. I recently purchased a 2004 Corvette Z06 and it's already broken. Now this is going to be a slightly different style of video. Normally I do like how-to videos, so I'll do a video on that of what I'm repairing. I'll link that in the description below. But basically I've got my first autocross event with this car. I bought this car to do more track days and I intend to do that. So that is in about 2 weeks. But in the meantime, I have a business trip for about 1 week, which means I only have a couple days to get this ready. And problem 2 is I don't want to trailer my cars to events. I want to drive it to the event, do the event, and then drive back, which is why I bought something that was supposed to be more reliable even though it already has an engine light on. But as part of driving it to the event, it's got to be street legal, which means it has to pass state emissions inspection, which you can't do if there's a check engine light. So I already changed the fluids in the car. I got new oil in it, I got new brake fluid in it, I did pads and rotors with a more aggressive compound on all 4 corners. Today we're going to fix the check engine light. This video will cover not only the process of getting the car repaired, but also getting it inspected, including something I don't touch up on the other video, which is the reality of repairing a car and all the things that go wrong that you don't plan for. So with that said, let's get right into it. Today we are fixing a P0492 error code on a 2004 Z06. So it is a secondary air system. You have 2 little check valves on the system. Here's the first one here on the passenger side, and a check valve lets air go through one way but not the other way. So that's the first one, but the one that failed is the passenger side, quote unquote passenger side. The problem is it's not here like the driver's side is, it's somewhere up here behind the intake manifold. I discussed this in the other video as well, but there's 2 ways to do this. You can either try to clean out the system by spraying a cleaner into it. So I was gonna try that first, knowing that I could just get this through inspection, get through the first event, and then do the proper repair later. But the proper repair to replace the passenger side valve requires pulling the intake manifold. So let's start with just trying to clean this thing out. You can see there's like a little clip here, and then the hose goes down and back. That's the one we're working with. So we are going to start by undoing this clip right here. Just like I described in the how-to video, I start by popping off the hose to spray the cleaner into the system to try to clean out the valve, and we are immediately greeted by the first warning sign of me purchasing this car. And now looking in here, you can see that's all scratched up, so this is probably a problem that's happened before. This means that the previous owner has probably already done this a number of times trying to clear the engine light prior to selling the car to me, which makes this the second consecutive sports car that I've purchased with a questionable history of hidden repairs. So what do we learn here? Stop buying sports cars from people in Connecticut because they seem to be shady. So immediately knowing that this has come back and that it's been previously repaired, my confidence that this is going to work by just spraying cleaner in this is a little bit lower already. But like I said, I was in a time crunch to just get this thing road legal so I could get to that first event and get through it. So I decided to proceed with it anyway, considering that this is only like a 10 to 20 minute repair job in total. And worst case, I wouldn't really lose anything if it didn't work because I already had the cleaners on hand to do this and I hadn't already ordered the parts. So I went through the process of filling the system with cleaner, blowing it through the system with compressed air, and then doing the same thing with WD-40 at the end to try to lubricate the valve. Then I reinstalled the hose and clamp, cleared the engine code, and fired it up to see if I had done this right or if it didn't work and I was wasting my time. Now I don't have any exciting footage for this, but after I reset the engine codes, I went out, put a bunch of miles in the car, and then showed up to my state inspection appointment the next morning and found out that the car's emissions system wasn't fully reset, so that I technically failed inspection. Now they give you like a leeway of a couple days to come back once the emission system is ready, but the second the emission system became ready, the engine light came back on, which means we hadn't permanently solved this problem. So on to plan B, doing what I should have done in the first place and fixing it properly. I got the parts ordered, but now we were in crunch time. I'd be home for less than a week before that first event. I still had to get the car inspected, and I wanted to get a little bit of seat time with the new parts installed to make sure that nothing else was wrong prior to revving the piss out of the engine for the entire day at the track. Now, as I already stated, that means we have to pull off the intake manifold, which is not something that I like doing because it's a pain in the ass. I've also never worked on an LS engine before, so there's definitely a learning curve with this, and pulling off an intake manifold is somewhat involved. You gotta pull off the fuel lines, you gotta pull a bunch of the wiring harness. It's not necessarily the nice warm introduction that you want when you're working on a new engine. And when you combine that with my perpetual fear that I'm going to repair something wrong, even though I really haven't had any major issues on my repairs before, there's just that chronic inherent fear in the back of my brain that pulling off a big portion of the engine is going to mess something
something up. And I think that's just human nature, but for whatever reason, there is always that fear in the back of my mind. Now, with the learning curve and with setting up the camera to try to make a video out of this, it probably took me about 3 to 4 hours in total, but I did eventually get the intake manifold off, but not without its issues. This car had about 86,000 miles on it when I was doing this repair, and obviously it's getting close to 20 years old at this point. Some of the clips in the engine bay, being this old plastic, are really heat cycled, they're really brittle. I snapped at least one of them, and I'll dive into a little more detail on that in a minute, but for now I was just rejoicing at making it this far, so let's take a look at what's next.
Alright, took me a lot more effort than I anticipated it to take, but I do have the intake manifold off, and I totally broke at least one plastic clip that I now have to find a replacement for. Coming around here to the passenger side, the new check valve looks like this. So that's what we're looking for, and it's going to come off of this pipe here that I'm highlighting. So we're just going to follow that over, and it's literally way down here in the back. That is what we were going for this whole time. So now we're going to rip off this old one, and by rip off I mean carefully unbolt and then bolt in the new one. But while we're down here, you probably notice things like this, which is a loose hose clamp. It's not attached to anything. So I think someone has been in here before. Another reason why is this hose here. You can see it's like really rough cut there on the edge. That looks like it was almost hand sawed. They cut this line in half rather than just attaching it right here where it obviously already detaches from. That's the hose that goes here to the back of the intake manifold. I think they did that because they were working on something else. They shoved the pipe in there and they called it good enough. So I suspect this has been a problem before, or if not this exact thing, then something else similar in this region.
So that is indicator number 2 that somebody has been tampering with this before and not necessarily repairing it properly, but at least I have my dogs here for emotional support. Alright, now for unbolting the valve. We have 2 issues here that we're kind of fighting. The first is that it's in a horrible location to access and it's very difficult to get a wrench on anything back there. And the second issue is that these nuts are absolutely huge and I did not have a 1-inch wrench at first to fit over the larger of the two. Now let's say for some reason you don't have the right size wrench for this and you want to use an adjustable wrench, which I actually tried to do anyway just because the handle was a little bit shorter and I could fit it back there easier. You can set up the size of it using the nuts that are accessible on the other valve that you don't have to replace yet. Now that said, I tried this and it didn't work and I ended up buying a different wrench anyhow because the adjustable one was just rounding the crap out of this thing because these get so corroded that they are fused onto that line. So by all means, feel free to try it, but just know right now that you're not going to be successful.
Alright, it's about 9:30. I've been at this for longer than I care to admit. I was trying to get this done tonight and be lazy. It's just not going to work. I'm going to strip it real quick is what I'm getting at. Now problem number 2, it's currently a Friday night. I'm flying out for a business trip first thing Monday morning. So if I don't get this done, it has to sit for another week. And if it sits for a week, I run the very legitimate risk of forgetting how all of this goes back together. I would say it's early the next day, but it's now about halfway through the next day because I spent the whole morning trying to shop for a replacement for this hose. So this is the one that was right here, which it turns out I didn't even need to remove, connecting the little vapor canister thing over to the throttle body / inlet manifold. Now the problem is you can't buy the little clips for it, even though it's probably like $1 for the clip or something. The hose itself was like $15 to $20, not too bad. So I wanted to just order one, even if it was going to take a week to get here, but it's discontinued and the new replacement part is also discontinued. That was one of the issues I was trying to avoid, was difficulty sourcing parts by getting a Corvette as a more trackable car, but it seems like we already have an issue. So instead, I have got this is a $2 piece of pipe. I got a 10-pack of these, so these are about 70 cents each for these clamps, and for $4 roughly, we're going to try to bridge that gap instead. This is just an eyeball of something that was fairly close. We're gonna hope that it fits, and actually, ooh, that's nice and snug. That's pretty much perfect. I also have an obscenely large wrench now, a 1-inch that's gonna fit, but the problem is I can't exactly turn it when it gives me this much total space and it doesn't line up with the threads. So either way, I'm going to have to pull out that valve on the back, which means I have to disconnect the bracket holding it, which means I needed this, a little thingy that angles.
Back at it now after a good night's sleep and buying the world's cutest ratchet. It still took me about 45 minutes to an hour of fighting the bracket and the hose to get these things out of the car. But alas, we accomplished what we set out to do.
Hours and hours of fighting. And I finally got this stupid hose out.
When I first put the new and the old valve next to each other, the threads and everything were definitely the same size, but the size of the port that the tubing went over looked like it was a little bit different, so that made me a little bit nervous, but it worked out just fine. And using the flashlight to look into it, it doesn't really show it on camera, but the old one was really gunked up and charred and kind of blackened on the inside. I'm not really surprised at all that that was not working and through the engine light. And the new one was this like bright whitish silver and perfectly clean. So it was very obvious why the old one wasn't working when you saw what it was supposed to look like. Continuing with the removal of the valve, I put it in my vice grip, and I found out very quickly how seized this was, because even when I put the nut directly into the vise, I was literally spinning my entire vise with the bench attached when I was trying to turn the wrench on this thing. But you know what they say, if your vice grip can't fix it, get yourself a cutting wheel and a bigger hammer. And if that's not already something they say, well, we should make that an expression, because that seems to work pretty good.
All right, cutting off the top portion of the valve, just looking in there. Look how caked and gross that all is. So that's why it's not moving.
At this point, you might be asking yourself, why don't you just buy another hose? Because that is definitely something that I asked myself. And the answer is, if you could find these, because again, parts obsolescence is apparently a problem on Corvettes, they were $143 for this hose. Yeah, no thanks. So I gotta say, once I got this nut off, that was the biggest sigh of relief, knowing that I wouldn't have to spend $200 on some rubbers because I did a sufficient job working the nut. After which I was ready to start sucking. And once I had the block cleaned off and I had all the new gaskets in for the manifold, I went to start putting the manifold back in to realize that I was missing one of my manifold bolts. And I don't know if you know this about engines, but it's generally not a good idea to have a 5 or 6 inch long bolt inside of some moving parts. Yeah, most people would consider that to be a bad thing. I think I touched every single inch of this engine bay with the magnet to try to pull that bolt out, and I came up with absolutely nothing. So here is what I did next.
Being the absolute OCD aerospace engineer type guy that I am not comfortable of just running this thing without having that bolt accounted for in case it got into any of the belts or the rotating bits, because I don't want to break those, because these engines are somewhere between like 6 and 10 grand to replace. What I'm going to do now is go and scrounge on my footage yesterday, the time lapse that I took of when I pulled all this intake stuff off, to see if I can actually capture the moment that the bolt fell, roughly where the intake was placed, and get a better idea of where it fell to.
And it took a little bit of searching, but here is the exact frame, and it fell somewhere below the batteries. So it looks like I had to pull that out next. Great. So further searching with my long, attractive stick still yielded no results, so this thing fell down into the fender liners. I would literally have to start pulling out the wheel well or the fender itself to get to it, but I could at least conclude for now that it wasn't going to hit anything that was moving, and let's just cut to how frustrated I was, because this was definitely getting to me at this point.
Shouldn't be this difficult, but this is why people pay mechanics money, and it's sounding more and more like something that I'm going to have to realistically consider in the future, because Jesus Christ, that was a lot of time searching for a bolt!
Having successfully vented my frustrations, I was ready to put the manifold back in the car for real this time, which went actually somewhat smooth, which I was surprised by. That meant this had to, of course, be a trap, because nothing can go smoothly when you're working on a car. I believe that is law. Don't quote me on that one, I'm not a lawyer. But if nothing else, I got everything in except for obviously the bolt that I was missing. I got the new bolts ordered, and when I returned from my work trip, guess what had already arrived? Oh yeah, it's business time, baby. So this was the home stretch. The appointment was set for the next morning. The end was in sight, and we were finally going to get this thing actually road legal, except that you can probably see how much video is left and know that that's probably not going to be the case. So here's the next issue we ran into, which is something I was worried was going to happen, didn't listen to my gut, and then it definitely happened.
What we have discovered is that my torque wrench is not remotely accurate at the low settings, as evidenced by this bolt that is now sheared in half, and this is not a short boy. That's farther than I would be able to drill unless I pull off the entire intake manifold again. So I am not thrilled. So that's frustrating, but I've got an event in a week. I really need to get this thing inspected, which means I got to get miles on it with the new valve and the intake reassembled, and my chance to do that is tomorrow morning. And if I can't do that, then I am missing my event next week to pull off the intake manifold again and drill out this bolt, or what remains of this bolt, and retap it. So let's get back to it.
Now for the record, that bolt that I snapped is one of the only old manifold bolts that I used. It's one of the ones I put in originally when I was holding this in place while I was on my business trip. And being lazy, I didn't think to swap it out with a new bolt when I got back because it was already in place. But I made the executive decision that one day of low RPM driving was not going to blow up the engine. I could get it through inspection, assuming of course that it ran properly with the one bolt snapped. So let's check that first.
All right, remaining bolts are torqued, but not completely over torqued due to my useless wrench. Battery's back in, all the tools and stuff are still out. I'm gonna fire this up real quick, make sure we don't have any glaring issues, immediate check engine lights, because I'd like to think that we would get one pretty quickly if there was an issue with the intake manifold not sealing. But either way, let's start it now, see what it does.
Spoiler alert, nothing. It did nothing because the battery was dead. So let me just say that my experience so far with my quote-unquote reliable track car is, yeah, it's not great. Not doing so good, Corvette. So let it trickle charge for a little bit, and let's try this again. I was immediately greeted by a low power light and 4 new check engine lights because the sensor that I plugged in wasn't fully plugged in because the Corvette has such great high build quality and is super easy and convenient to work on.
Now going here, the codes we have are throttle pedal position, 2 circuits, and then throttle actuator control. So that was all relative to the plug that I had undone like an absolute imbecile. So what I'll do now, clear these codes, fire it up, and hope for the best. Oh, I killed the battery again. All right, back to square one.
Back on the battery tender it went, and I decided the smartest move was to immediately drive this about 60 miles away from my house without any jumper cables, because I, of course, only have the best ideas known to man.
We are in the Z06 now, and you might recognize that this is not my garage, so I put about 100 miles on this today. Right now I'm about 60 miles or so from my house, and while I was here after putting the mileage on, I did check the emission system readiness using my handheld OBD2 scanner. So at this point, everything is showing ready. All my modules are set, and I still have no check engine lights. So if I can go to my doctor's appointment and then make it home and I still don't have anything on, the first thing I'm going to do tomorrow is go to the garage and get the inspection sticker. Then, assuming that goes well, I'll have time to pull off the intake manifold again and replace the bolt that I snapped prior to my first autocross this Sunday. So the clock is on. Wish me the best. Here we go.
And fast forward to the next day, where somehow, mythically, beyond all belief, I passed state inspection, so I get to tear the car apart again, which it's, you know, I'm not looking forward to that. But on the plus, I had the learning curve out of the way, so that went a lot smoother, and rather than taking me 3 to 4 hours, it took me 30 to 45 minutes while talking on the phone and worrying about camera angles. So honestly, a lot faster, I broke a lot less stuff. Well, let's take a quick look at that bolt that I snapped.
So this is supposed to look like these, where it's a hole and instead it's a plug. So I have to drill that out.
I broke out my easy outs and got to work on removing the snapped bolt, and some of you might be thinking, hey, shouldn't you cover that intake plenum to not get metal shavings in there? Yeah, you're probably right, but on the other hand, at this point, f this car. If it wants to treat me like trash, I'm going to treat it like trash. But honestly, the drill was going a lot slower than it might look on the time lapse, so I wasn't really flinging things everywhere anyhow, and I'm going to vacuum it up. So don't worry, I'm not actually trying to grenade my engine. I'm way too poor for that. But hey, will you look at that? That hole now looks hole-shaped, and this little piece is what broke off in there, and that's quite a bit. Don't you hate it when just the tip breaks off? Cause I do. Anyhow, back to cleaning up the metal shavings and reassembling this for hopefully the last time, because I am so ready to be done with this stupid project. And I'm also terrified to say these words out loud, but it seems like the reinstall went pretty smooth, which tells me that something's probably wrong and I just haven't figured out what it is yet. But either way, we're gonna try to fire this up and hope nothing bursts into flames. Is that foreshadowing? Please don't be foreshadowing.
Sounding good. Oil pressure's good. No engine lights. Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Yeah, that's sounding good. All right, so I'm happy with this for now. Let's kill it and we'll take it out on the road probably tomorrow for a bit.
It's now the next day. I took the car around town just to run a little bit of errands. Nothing too crazy, a couple partial throttle pulls, but it is running noticeably better than it was before. I think it's got a little bit more partial throttle strength. It seems to be idling a little bit smoother as well. And it also smells noticeably less like gasoline than it did before. And that's not to say it was reeking of gasoline, but there was a slight scent when you were sitting still for a while. So that is also gone at this point. The Autocross event is in 2 days from now. So I'm going to go put some harder miles on this, but the next episode with this car will be doing that Autocross event. Now, we've already figured out how much I dislike working on this car and how it's not nearly as reliable as it claimed to be, but next episode we'll see how slow it is as well and how terrible I am at driving it, and whether or not those metal shavings are actually going to detonate my engine. But that'll do it for this episode. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.
Nose print. What are you doing? I've just washed that. And now it's got a puddle of nose snot. You can have a dog, you can have a clean car, but you cannot have both for long.